Hello, I'm Jackie Lucky, your financial planning maestro. This series of podcasts is aimed at financial planning professionals and also those who are looking to enter the financial planning profession. We will be talking during the podcast about all things certified financial planner certification related, talking to other CFPs around the world, and also we will be dropping in on some new entrants who've just entered the financial planning profession, and we'll be checking up along the way on a regular basis with them to see how they're getting on. I hope you enjoy today's podcast. Hello and welcome. I'm Jackie Lucky, your financial planning maestro. And in today's podcast, I've got a really exciting guest, and that is Martin Lines from Just. Hello, Martin.
Hi, Jackie. Good to speak to you again today.
And you. And today we are talking about one of both of our favourite subjects, aren't we? We're talking about vulnerable clients.
Absolutely, yeah.
So we've got quite a few questions already in to get through. So I think there are lots of listeners who are on listening to this who are new to the profession and perhaps haven't or still starting to get to grips with very early stages of their exams, and perhaps don't know that much about vulnerable clients and what we've all been up to, I think, since 2016 when the regulator started looking into this. Yeah. So perhaps we could just start there and give us a quick overview of what's happened since they put vulnerable clients on their radar all those years ago now.
Yeah, certainly. I think the focus on vulnerability has been there for some time, as you say, going back to occasional paper number 8 for those who want to look up all the documents, but really recognising that whilst we got things like treating customers fairly and the principles around that and the COBS rules and everything else, there was this understanding that was coming through that for certain individuals, maybe processes needed to change. Maybe we needed to take account of different vulnerabilities that exist there and, how certain clients might interact with financial services firms. So they recognised that through the publication of that document and started a discussion going then. And then subsequently you had the likes of the British Bankers Association and the Vulnerability Task Force. And then, a lot of consultations around an ageing population specifically and access to advice. Although I think, it's important to note that vulnerability isn't just exclusively something that applies to the later life market. And so they started to recognise that there's all sorts of things that consumers might be going through, experiences that they might be going through, which will impact on their decision making and the way they interact with firms. And so we've had things like DP 16.1, looking at the later life market, as I say. And then you've had things like a duty of care paper that was issued a few years ago, which has now been revisited. And then in the last couple of years specifically, some guidance consultations, and then the finalised guidance more recently in terms of what firms should be doing about adapting their processes for those who might be deemed as vulnerable.
Yeah. So it's been a huge project for the financial services regulator over the last, more than 5 years now, hasn't it?
Yeah. Absolutely. And I think, whilst I talk about the fact that they've issued finalised guidance, I just wonder whether it is that final, because I think this is going to be a running theme throughout lots of policy decisions and lots of other regulation and guidance that is out there. So more recently, you've seen things like a new consumer duty that came out in May. Yeah. And again, whilst it's not sort of labelled as vulnerability, it does talk about some of the same themes. So are we acting in a way that is going to enable clients to get good outcomes? Are we actually producing products and services that are going to give the best outcomes, whether the client is vulnerable or not? And there's this cultural perspective that comes through as well in terms of recommendation of your firm's product and services to your friends and family, whatever the circumstance might be. So I think it's one of those things that, yes, we've got the vulnerability agenda, but I think it goes through into, lots and lots of areas of, the FCA's agenda going forward as well.
Yeah, I think so. And I think maybe it's been heightened or, still kept at the top of the agenda because of the effects around the pandemic. So I think, correct me if I'm wrong, Martin, but I saw something a while ago saying that the FCA had indicated they thought about 50% of all advised clients could potentially be classed as vulnerable during the pandemic.
Yeah, that's right. There was a Financial Live survey last year, and in the February, I think the figures around about 46% of UK adults had one of the characteristics of vulnerability under 4 drivers that they denote. And then through the pandemic, they looked again in the October, and that figure had increased to 53%. Now you might say, well, okay, that's still around the 40-50% mark. A lot of people would say that actually, anyone could be vulnerable at any point in time. And certainly I think the pandemic has exacerbated vulnerability. We hear that on the news all the time now, don't we?
Yeah.
Vulnerable consumers, looking after the most vulnerable, and it's become almost part of normal sort of language that we've been hearing over the last 18 months or so.
Yeah.
But when they look at those 4 main drivers, what they're talking about there is the effect on things like health, whether that be physical health. And of course, that's been a conversation piece over the pandemic, of course, for obvious reasons. But it's not just the physical health of people that is coming to question and how they've been affected by things like coronavirus, but what's been the mental health impact as well. And has that caused people to be in vulnerable circumstances, the stresses, the strains, the concerns around that? And we're starting to hear more and more of that coming through as well as something that we all need to take account of when people are making these, certainly from our perspective, these big financial decisions as well.
Yes, yeah. And it's really interesting that, you were just touching on there that actually it's not necessarily just perhaps the older generations who have been suffering, but actually young people or people from all walks of life and of all ages. And also that the issue of that it could be a temporary vulnerability.
Yeah.
And I think maybe that's certainly, we've discussed this before, haven't we? One of the biggest things for me that I think, if you're in the financial advice world and you are intending to service clients, whether that means, for those of you listening, if you're new to the profession and, if you're picking up the telephone to clients, interacting with clients, that actually everybody in that firm has a responsibility to start to spot those differences, don't they?
Absolutely. And that's exactly it. And sometimes you might notice a step change that, if you're living with that individual, so a family member, you don't necessarily see these step changes. Whereas if you've got somebody who's in contact with a firm once in a while or, on a fairly regular basis, but, you might just notice those step changes where, see a different change in behavior for some clients. So they're starting to ask you questions that perhaps they wouldn't have asked before, or asking you to slow down a bit, or something just doesn't sound quite right. Or, particularly in this time, they might be saying things like, my son or daughter looks after that sort of thing for me. And that's perhaps a new thing. And maybe some new questions need to be asked there around, whether that's a permanent situation, whether there needs to be an authority put in place there, or even a power of attorney if there isn't one already.
Yeah.
So you can start to spot these differences in characteristics of consumers on that sort of step change basis as well. And I think you're right in terms of, this sort of aspect of vulnerability happening at any point and people coming in and out of vulnerability, this sort of transient vulnerability situation as well. And sometimes I think we look at the client as being a vulnerable client, but actually there might be other people involved in that conversation too. So you can imagine somebody at the moment who has been looking after a mum or dad who might be vulnerable, and that might, and it's the older generation you might think is a vulnerable person.
Yeah.
But of course, you've now got somebody who might be caring for that individual. And maybe that's had other impacts in terms of, have they had to give up hours at work, for example, to look after that person? Have they had to navigate through the care system and to find out what benefits are available? And again, there might be other stresses and strains there as well.
Yeah.
So when we talk about vulnerability, it's not just one vulnerability that might apply. There might be multiple things that are layered, if you like. That
Yes.
means that, people are facing a number of different things all at the same time.
Yeah.
And I think, if we look at, we mentioned health there, but there's also this whole area of what the FCA term life events that are these ups and downs of life, these different circumstances that people fall into along life's journey, really. And it covers things like, bereavement, divorce, loss of a job, lots of things that are being tested through the pandemic as well. We hear about people being furloughed. And one of the things I saw on LinkedIn recently, after I'd done a session around this, was that we had an advisor firm who was saying, look, we treat our customers fairly. We've got everything down in terms of, the way we operate our processes and making sure that our consumer needs are met. Yep. However, we do have circumstances now where people who we wouldn't have previously termed as vulnerable have now got real vulnerabilities, real issues in terms of health and wealth. Yes. And it's been in some ways a bit of a leveler, the last 18 months. And this perception that vulnerable clients are a particular, socioeconomic group, or as we've said before, a certain age group, has really been called into question now. So you've got people that might be entrepreneurial who are reliant on producing their own income. Well, how resilient have they been through the pandemic? What impact has these life events had on health and so on? And I think financial resilience is kind of the third area. So you've got health, life events, and financial resilience is a big one as well. Yeah. How financially resilient is the client to downturns in the market that we've seen, to furloughing, loss of jobs, etc.? How long would they be able to cope without asking for help from friends and family? And from a financial planning perspective, what other things might we have to bring into the equation? Yes. And so there's that whole aspect as well in terms of the financial resilience, but there are other types of resilience we need to look at as well, of course.
Yeah. Oh, I read some research, I think it was from L&G back in March, that was suggesting that the bank of mum and dad is more alive than it's ever been in decades, helping particularly adult children who are struggling financially with being furloughed. That's having, a huge knock-on effect for, a number of different families, a number of different generations, and the financial impact, the extra financial planning that, our planners out there will need to do to virtually ask those questions and not just assume that, that they can get by, or that, the adult children are okay. And that, the parents are worried, as well as their adult children being worried as well.
Yeah, absolutely. You've always, or for some time, we've been talking about, this kind of sandwich generation. And people, perhaps if they're going into retirement, for example, or are in retirement, will have parents on one hand who might be at that stage in life where they need extra care, or even, residential domiciliary care, in the wider sense. And then you've got people who have not yet been on the housing ladder. We've got university fees to pay for, student loans, those sorts of things. Yeah. And I keep hearing this phrase at the moment, YOLO, which apparently means you only live once.
Oh, right. Okay.
And I just wonder, with the pandemic, whether people have started to think about, put things into perspective, and thinking about, what they might want to do post-pandemic. Do they need to help somebody else out who's perhaps, as you say, a son or daughter who's struggling financially because of job losses and things like that? Or do they want to just say, do you know what, life's too short and let's actually go and enjoy ourselves? But all of that needs to take account of what that long-term view is. Yes. And I think the other thing is with regards to financial resilience, things like you might come across people who've had payment holidays and things like that, which is a great initiative. But has that gone hand in hand with financial advice and financial planning?
Yes.
Because if it hasn't, and it's just a bit of a bonus that, there are things that we've not had to pay for, we need to make sure that there's a future plan around that in terms of what happens next.
Yes.
So I think that's an important part of it as well.
It is. And I can imagine that, parents of adult children and, parents of, school and university leavers will be changing their plans of the future as well. So I think actually, this is a good time when they're coming up to their reviews or annual reviews with financial planners to be asking those sorts of questions, isn't it?
Absolutely. And that's what financial planning is all about. Of course, what is the plan? What's the life plan? And how does the financial side of things actually support that and enable you to do all of those things,
Yeah.
And I think the other, we talk about resilience, and I mentioned it briefly in terms of life events as well. But when the FCA talk about the area of resilience, they talk about financial resilience, as we've been saying, but they also talk about resilience in the wider sense of how resilient is that person to the life events side of things. So what are the characteristics of that individual? Have they been in circumstances before that were quite stressful for them? And how did they behave at that point during their life as well? And does that give us some clues in terms of how they might be feeling right now? Or looking at, how they're coping with the stresses and strains of the pandemic and things like that, does this give us some clues in terms of, what support they might need in the future as well? Yes. So you've got that emotional resilience side of the equation to look at, as well as the financial.
Yeah, one of my beloved questions that I quite often used to ask my clients, and no number of other financial planners do now, is about how they met each other. If you've got couples, and what their financial situation was when they met, and just to let them talk through how they felt. If one, quite often, one would be helping the other financially, how it felt for both of them to be in their respective situations, and actually if those sorts of feelings have come back out again because of the pandemic. Yeah,
absolutely, and I think that's it. It's been such a change in circumstances for everybody, and it's what's the default position in those areas? What's the natural go-to position, and how do people behave in those circumstances? Yes. So I think it's a really good question to ask. And the other thing I think perhaps connected with that is the fourth area. So we look at health, life events, resilience, and that whole area of capability as well. Yeah. And again, I think sometimes from a financial planning perspective, this is an area that planners can underestimate the impact that they have, because I think it was something like, and this goes back to that original OP8 document, it was saying that 1 in 7 adults has literacy skills that are expected of a child 11 or below. Wow. And just under half of UK adults, I think, had a numeracy attainment of age 11 or below as well. And sometimes we can underestimate or undervalue the impact that financial planning has, particularly if you've got people that are experts in their field of knowledge, whatever profession that might be. They won't necessarily have the same level of understanding of key financial concepts and terms and strategies that financial planners will have. That's why they've got a financial planner. Yes. And so you've got this capability in terms of on that level, and then beyond that, you might have some bigger issues in terms of real cognitive issues and other capabilities that might come to the fore as well. And you might have other bits that you might want to look at in terms of how do you make it easier for people to make those decisions? How do you present information in the correct way? Even looking at whether English might be their first language or not, or whether they might need some assistance in terms of I suppose it relates to some of the other areas as well, but large print, maybe they're hard of hearing. All these sorts of things might come to the fore as well. You might want to look at in terms of how you deal with certain clients differently. But I do think that is one that I think we sometimes undervalue around that as well.
And I think perhaps one of the other unintended consequences of the pandemic has been this huge jump. I was watching the news yesterday, this huge jump in the number of people who are now on specialist waiting lists under the NHS. Yeah. And so that there's now a kind of extra dimension for a lot of people who said, basically you couldn't get to the doctors for love or money, could you, for the last 18 months, other than kind of, your arm hanging off or whatever. But now there are a lot of people who've actually said, oh gosh, I've got a bit of a problem, I better go and see the doctor, I've waited long enough. And now they're in surgery territory or specialist consultant territory on a very long waiting list. Some people have been waiting more than 2 years to be seen by a very specialist consultant. So I think we're not out of this yet, and actually the longer term effects of the pandemic on how financial planners identify and support vulnerable people is still going to be ongoing, I think, for many years, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. And I think there's lots of things we don't know, aren't there? And people are concerned about things like long COVID and all these sorts of things. And again, The financial fallout, I don't think, we've fully experienced yet as we come out of the furlough scheme. What impact is that going to have? Or certainly when employers have to make a larger contribution, what impact will that have? And as you say, people have perhaps been resisting calling their doctor for things that they might think, well, they don't want to see me because, there's so much else going on regards COVID. But, there might be some serious issues that, as you say, people have been holding off from, and that might have just exacerbated their vulnerability, really, because things might have got worse for them. So there's all sorts of things. I know a lot of doctors have been saying, still call us. You still need to take care of yourself and make sure that you're having those appointments that you need, and so on. So it's there's a lot more to come, I think, on that side of things.
That's very, very wise words. So I think we both echo that if you feel that there's something wrong with you, then definitely go to contact your doctor in the first instance, and they won't think that you're being a nuisance to them, despite the pandemic still going on. So so let's look at what the future holds for vulnerable clients, where you think the FCA is going with this now, and are there any critical things? I mean, we've talked about also the guidance and things that have been issued earlier this year, but what's your gut feeling about how this is going to progress in the kind of short and medium term for our advisors and actually their support staff, those who are going through hopefully to become the advisors of the future?
I think the expectation's been raised, hasn't it? I mean, if we go back to the original definition, it's worth just noting this for people that aren't familiar with it, around vulnerable clients being those people that might be especially susceptible to detriment if particularly firms aren't acting with appropriate levels of care. And I think there are two ways of looking at that. One is, clearly the FCA will act if they see that firms aren't acting with care, and could they have conceivably known that the client was in vulnerable circumstances? But I think the other aspect is that there's always more to learn. So on an ongoing basis, I think there's an expectation for us to look at this in terms of what else can we do to drive good outcomes for consumers, and treat all consumers fairly, including, vulnerable consumers as well. So I think that's a given. But I think in terms of an ongoing agenda for the FCA, and we've already said that they've issued their finalised guidance, I really do think that this will be a running theme. So what they've said now is, after, as you say, 5 or 6 years of talking about this, and now they've issued the guidance, is to say, right, we're not going to have a benchmarking exercise where everyone has to meet a prescribed benchmark around this. Again, it's very much principles based, because I suppose they don't want people going to, people are doing really good things. They don't want to, people to lower down to a benchmark. But what they have said is that, senior managers can be expected to be asked now, what are you doing about vulnerability? How are you, how are you adopting that culture around vulnerability and doing the right things for vulnerable clients? What are you practically doing around that? And within the guidance, whilst they've been at pains to say, look, this isn't a tick box exercise, they have issued a lot of strategies and a lot of things that that firms might find useful as a starting point. And just to give you a shortcut, if you open the finalised guidance and the ones that have been in over the last couple of years, I think it's go to the middle pages and it'll sort of show you the process that you need to adopt. So I think, yes, senior managers can be expected to be asked, what are they doing about vulnerability? And I think the initiative is perhaps, on them really to say what measures they've taken. But has it been adopted as, from a cultural perspective? Is it discussed in board meetings? Does everyone know where the vulnerability policy is? We just got to make sure we're not just paying lip service to this. But the other aspect, I think you mentioned earlier around, the numbers of people that might be vulnerable. Whilst they sort of talk about 46 or 53% or whatever it was, and perhaps we could surmise that, as we said, everyone could be vulnerable at some point in time, they're going towards this recognition of a spectrum of vulnerability to show that, well, actually, perhaps we, at some point or another, we're all vulnerable. And, and they sort of look at the risk of harm to those people that might, be more likely to have differentiated needs. And again, if you look at the guidance, there's a diagram on that. So they kind of moved away a little bit from this vulnerability and potential vulnerability to where are people on that spectrum in terms of risk of harm.
Yes.
And the other expectation, which I suppose, feeds into things like prod and client segmentation, is to have a real understanding of the characteristics of vulnerability that might exist in your target market, or the phrase they use is customer base.
Yeah.
So whilst we've seen that every client is individual, they'll all have their own needs, and you might have to look at bespoke services for different individuals. On a macro level, I suppose, are there any cohorts within your client bank that might be more susceptible to certain types of vulnerabilities than others?
Yes.
So I suppose if you've got people who are first-time buyers, for example. So one of the things in OP8 that the FCA talked about was being young could actually be a trigger of vulnerability because you haven't got that life experience.
Yeah.
So this is the biggest financial transaction this person may have made, or probably has made, in their life. First-time buyer, what experience have they had? And if there's a lack of experience there, does that mean that extra care needs to be taken to really explain to that client exactly what they're getting into, the commitment they're making, and so on? So that's one end of the spectrum. What vulnerabilities might occur there? And then we move into kind of our area, I suppose, which is sort of later life, or retirement and later life market. And whilst we've said that vulnerability doesn't necessarily, it's not necessarily exclusive for that particular cohort, again, there might be things that present themselves more often in that area than others. And health, we know that people's health declines, generally speaking, the older somebody gets. So talk about key financial terms and concepts, and talked about capability. And what DP 16.1, which is a discussion paper on the aging population, says is that whilst people might have, really grasped some of the key concepts by retirement age, it does decline rapidly by around age 75, generally speaking. Yeah. And then you've got the other sort of health issues and things like that, need for long-term care. So are there any areas within your client bank that you might want to focus on specifically? Are there any sort of research documents that you need to find out a little bit more about? Are there any, again, particular areas that you might want to look at? Have you got a vulnerability champion within your firm who might really want to take up the mantle for that and go and get a few more details? In that later life market, it might be a case of, could your firm benefit from being associated with Dementia Friends, for example, or some of those organisations? Yeah. So that was another thing that I saw came out within the finalised guidance, which I think just gives a good indication of how this has become a bigger topic, and one that's looked at not just from an individual perspective, but what the firm is doing as a whole in terms of its client bank as well.
Yeah. And one of the things that when I've been speaking to financial planners, is they've said that there are some issues regarding how they identify somebody as being vulnerable, how you might tell somebody that, a client, that you are intending to treat them as vulnerable. Perhaps they've, their circumstances have changed. They've become, more stressed or more forgetful or whatever it might be. Do you have any words of wisdom about how to go about doing that? Because I think firstly, there were potentially GDPR issues of actually writing that on your CRM system. Yeah. And then, but actually what's more important is how you go about having that conversation with the client.
Yeah, it's very difficult. I mean, we've got some guides, and there is some guides from the FCA and some sort of phrases that they use, idea and Texas drill and things like that, and question sets, that might be helpful, but they're, often there for very specific circumstances. So you might have things like, if you're sort of asking a client around a sensitive area where they might be vulnerable, it's, really, if we use a Texas drill, I suppose it's telling a client what the information is going to be used for, and explaining what that use is going to be, and getting their explicit consent in order to use that, and of course the ramifications of going forward without that particular piece of disclosure as well, I think is quite important. Asking if they need any other assistance in that area, and then it might be a case of signposting them to somewhere else. But It is a very sensitive area. I think one of the things that we found, we did some research is going back a little while now, where we surveyed a number of firms, and it was one of the things they identified was that this term vulnerability was one that people would be or could be very affronted by.
Yeah.
And whether it's a case of not wanting to disclose vulnerability because it was seen, perhaps as sensitive or weakness and things like that, or whether it be because actually sometimes it's very hard to articulate, it certainly is a challenge for firms. And I think one of the key things is that whilst the FCA agenda is around consumer vulnerability, that isn't necessarily the terminology that you actually have to use. So I know other organizations will talk about, for example, an extra care policy, and it's just recognizing whether in those 4 key areas, and some would argue there are more, have we asked questions pertaining to those 4 areas? And whilst you might not necessarily wish to term a client vulnerable, have we documented the extra considerations that we might want to take in those 4 areas? So it's not necessarily a case of saying to the client, we are going to mark you down as vulnerable. It might just be having a policy that says, if we identify that this client needs some extra help in this area, they've got a health condition or, they're going through a life event at the moment, it is what extra care are we taking because of that particular circumstance? So I don't think you have to use that vulnerability terminology or make it, quite as distinct as that. And I think the other thing is always keeping that under review.
Yeah.
And, as you said, people can go in and out of circumstances which might mean that they need extra care around these areas. And it's just keeping on top of that, how their circumstances changed. So I think it is a sensitive area, but I think that one of the key things is we don't have to label clients as being vulnerable. There are other things you can use, and again it's coming back to this cultural perspective. It's not saying there is a tick box exercise whereby you must label this client as vulnerable. It's some would say it's almost like it's still TCF and it's still looking at know your customer, the things you'd be doing anyway, and in a sense it's bringing together all of those principles under one banner and just reminding people that there are folk out there who might need that extra level of assistance or might need you to alter the process specifically for them, but they don't need to necessarily be called or labelled vulnerable.
Yeah. And I think one of the things that always strikes me is that what a great practical thing to do might be to discuss your vulnerable policy with every client at each client meeting.
Yes.
Because then if they become vulnerable, they kind of know what's coming, or if they start to feel that they might want a little bit of extra support, in between, perhaps an annual review, that actually they feel, open enough to be able to come to you and to say, I'm in the middle of a crisis, or, whatever it might be, and finding things difficult, at that particular moment in time, and actually talking to individuals when you think that at the moment they're not specifically being classed as vulnerable, actually might be a good thing to kind of head it off as well.
Absolutely. And I think some firms do that, and they'll say, and they'll be quite open about it. So on one hand, you've got this sort of couching it in different terminology. On the other hand, we also know there are firms that are very upfront about it and say, look, this is to protect you, not necessarily now, but if circumstances change in the future, and it's something that we need to do to make sure we've got all these things covered off. In the same way, I suppose, as you might start to talk to people about, powers of attorney. Yes. Or wills and things like that. Now, they also, you could say, they're sensitive areas, but almost people see that as a given. Yes, we've got to talk about these things. Should you get into a circumstance where you need a substitute decision maker? And people tend to be fairly upfront about those sorts of discussions. Yeah. And so, it's an odd one where you think, well, actually, if you treated it in the same way, that might work for a number of firms that says, this is our vulnerable clients policy. This is why we do it, and here's how it protects you should your circumstances change.
Yeah, I think I like the term kind of extra care, extra support, those kinds of things. That kind of feels a little softer around the edges. The vulnerable bit does seem to feel a bit like a sledgehammer to crack a nut situation sometimes. But I guess also it depends on how you see life. I guess for some people they'll think, well, that's fine, they're being straight with me, but other clients might feel oh gosh, do I have to pass the test every year now to make my financial planner think that I'm okay or whatever.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the bits of the skill set, isn't it? Around, I mean, we could talk about reciprocity and all these sorts of things in terms of, the information that's being shared between the financial planner and the client, and building up that relationship that will enable you to have that open conversation,
yes.
And how you elicit that information from a client in the sort of friendliest way possible, the most understanding way possible. And I think that's where that skill set comes in, and I do wonder whether, given the pandemic, and we mentioned that term vulnerability is being used more and more, I just wonder whether people would be more, less affronted now that it's become more part of the normal language around that as well. So perhaps people are more open to it. And I think we've definitely seen a cultural shift over the last few years anyway, around vulnerability and, people willing to sort of share their life experiences and the difficulties they have and so on. I think culturally, is more acceptable to talk about those sorts of issues. And I think it's really important as well, because at the end of the day, it can affect people's financial well-being in the future if they don't disclose some of this information as well. And I think that's another phrase I've seen being used as well, is that financial well-being, again, rather than vulnerability as well. So there are a number of ways that you can do that, I think.
Yeah, and I think also as a byproduct of that, financial advisory staff are not immune to all of this, are they? To becoming vulnerable themselves.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think that it can be very distressing if you've got a client you've built up a relationship with over the years, and they're going through vulnerable circumstances, and there's a closeness with that client. Then clearly that could easily impact on somebody within the firm. And not only that, I think that if you look at the pandemic that we've been through, and again, just life events generally, is we all go through them.
Yes.
And one of the things the FCA talk about in terms of things we can do and can learn from this situation, and actually this, I think they published it before the pandemic, so it's probably relevant anyway, is what experiences have staff been through and how can they share that within the firm in terms of, okay, this was the situation that I was met with, this is how I handled it, and this might be a way that that you might want to look at this as well. So if you look at the pandemic and somebody looking after a vulnerable relative, for example, well, okay, what did they do differently? How did they communicate with that individual? What worked with them? What strategies did they employ? If you can bring that into your team to say, this is what happened to me during the pandemic, these are the circumstances I found myself in, can that help other members within your team? And then subsequently, we're all human, aren't we? So can that help people in terms of, when you develop your vulnerable clients policy, does that give us an understanding from a client perspective?
Yes.
Because how we responded might be exactly the same way as a client might respond. And how does that feed into the knowledge and understanding that we can sort of then build into the vulnerable clients policy itself?
And I think that's one of the things that we need to keep working on as financial planners, is to have that non-judgmental and open dialogue within firms, and actually between firms, sharing those experiences, isn't it? It's not just a case of thinking, oh gosh, I've been to hell and back, and now I'm going to have to sit there and explain to everybody, and they're going to go, well, I would have done it differently.
Yeah. Absolutely, yeah. I think there's lots of things you can do around say just sharing that knowledge and experience and how that might apply. And again, there is that knock-on impact, isn't there? Because as an individual who works within a firm, you might have sought advice from a third-party organisation, depending on the circumstance you went through. So again, when we look at the care market, I have met advisors who are involved in the long-term care market because they had to sort it out themselves for a relative.
Yes.
And that's what led them to get involved in that particular area of work. So there are really sort of wide impacts in terms of what staff members are going through themselves and how that can impact and actually help a firm in particular business areas and dealing with clients.
Yeah. It's fascinating stuff to be able to kind of be self-aware to be able to express yourself, explain what's happened, also get the support that you might need as we all go through our ups and downs of life, as well as supporting the financial planning clients out there in the community as well. So,
absolutely, yeah.
So this you touched on close to the start of our conversation, the new duty of care proposals. Just tell us a little bit about that, if you could, and how that might kind of impact. You said, it's kind of crossing over, isn't it, this area of vulnerability?
Yeah, that's right. And I think the theme comes through in a number of different documents that the regulator has been issuing. It always seems to be one of those things that's in the business plan, or very often is in the FCA business plan around treatment of vulnerable clients. But the new consumer duty that came out, I think it was May, they had promised to do that a little while ago. I think it was a couple of years ago when they looked at our future approach to consumers document.
Yeah.
And they said that as part of our approach to consumers, what we want to do is look at things like TCF and ask the question, does it go far enough? So paying due regard to the client's circumstance sounds great, but actually it should be more than that. So paying due regard is one thing, but actually having the client absolutely front and center of the process is something they started looking at. And should there be an extra duty of care that we need to have here? So it's kind of linked to the vulnerability agenda, and that consultation, which they promised to do post-Brexit. So here it is now. It's one of the things that hasn't been put on hold. Well, maybe it was for a little bit, but anyway, it came out in May, and I suppose there are three questions that it asks, which is firms should ask themselves what outcomes consumers should be able to expect from their products and services. So again, ties back into OP8. Now, OP8 said that, and again, it's in this one as well, started to talk about, do clients understand the products that they're buying, and is anything impairing them from understanding those products and services? So here's a word for today: price obfuscation. Is anything hidden? Is it easy to recognize, what a piece of marketing information says about a product, and then what's actually going on under the bonnet? So, do consumers understand those products? Are they able to, are they getting from those products and services what they ought to expect? And again, particularly, whether they're vulnerable or not really, but certainly applies to all clients. Are firms acting to enable clients? So I think that's one of the other things that is a key theme that's coming out at the moment, this enablement of clients to make good decisions, and particularly when we talk about the advice market, because consumer duty is across all financial services. But when we talk about financial planning and financial advice, it's enabling them to understand the decisions that are being made, perhaps on their behalf, and we're not doing anything that might hinder clients in getting good outcomes.
Yes.
So when we talk about the way we communicate with clients who might have cognitive difficulties, hearing difficulties, mobility issues, whatever it might be, are we offering a service that will enable those clients as well as would enable clients who don't have those sorts of issues? So, is it open to all? So ask yourselves what consumers should be able to expect from products and services, act to enable those clients, and again, it's very much like the vulnerability policy, assess the effectiveness of your actions. And those are the three things. So ask, act, and assess. And I think when you look at the vulnerability agenda, which talks about this ongoing monitoring and developing the vulnerability policy, and so what actions have you taken around this? How has it impacted on the service that you're giving? How has it impacted on outcomes? What do we need to change? Again, you've got this cyclical sort of situation where it's feeding back in. What do we do? What worked? What didn't work? And how can we change things going forward? So I think there's a massive tie-in with a new consumer duty. And whilst it's not labelled vulnerability necessarily, I think the parallels are definitely there, and it does go hand in hand.
Yeah.
So again, there's more to come out on that, I'm sure, as we start to really sort of analyse the pages of that document and see the wider impacts. But I think there's some really good principles there. I mean, one of the principles it talks about is using a clear tone and language and reflecting the overall standards of behaviour from the firm. So that cultural bit comes through as well. There's lots of sort of overarching themes. So it's again setting expectations for firms to act in the best interest of consumers.
That's probably a podcast all of its own for another time, Martin, isn't it? Okay, well, thank you very much for joining me, Martin. As always, it's been an absolute pleasure delving around in the world of vulnerability and how financial planners can, and all staff actually working at those firms can help identify those clients and support them along their life journeys. So thank you very much, and we'll hope to see you again. Maybe we can arrange another one for...
Yeah, I'd love to carry on the conversation. That'd be great.
Lovely. Thank you very much, Martin.
Thanks, Jackie.
I hope you enjoyed today's podcast. It's really interesting, isn't it, to listen to other people's points of view about different things, all relating to our wonderful financial planning profession. If you know anyone who might be interested in listening to any of these podcasts, please pass on our details to them. So that's it from me. Join me again next time when we'll be talking all things certified financial planner related, and also dropping in on our new entrants to the financial planning profession. Bye for now.